The media fixates on kinetic events. A Russian Shahed drone, modified with a man-portable air defense system, is presented as a novel threat. This is a strategic misdirection. These are low-cost kinetic probes, designed to force a high-cost response. The objective is not territory. It is draining the adversary's balance sheet. For every $1,000 drone, $1 million missile is fired in defense. The math is not sustainable. Analysts debate if a U.S. action in Venezuela would embolden China. This is the second layer of the protocol, forcing strategic overextension. Every regional provocation, from the South China Sea to the Caribbean, is a pull on a superpower's liquidity. It is a managed solvency crisis. But the real vector of attack is not kinetic. It is systemic. It is silent. The primary threat vector is not the missile. It is the termination of data flow. According to CSIS analysis, the global network of undersea fiber optic cables, which carries 95% of all international data, is a catastrophic single point of failure. These are the arteries of the global economy. Severing them is not a declaration of war. It is a declaration of insolvency. The secondary vector is orbital, not with anti-satellite missiles which are crude and traceable, but with non-kinetic blinding. Reports from RUSI detail methods of dazzling or permanently burning out the sensors of critical imaging and communication satellites using ground-based lasers. No explosion, no debris field, just a slow, silent cataract forming over the eye of the system. This two-pronged assault on the nervous system of power creates the ultimate strategic liability, the blind Leviathan. A superpower with unmatched kinetic force, aircraft carriers, fifth-generation fighters, rendered inert. It cannot see the enemy, it cannot command its forces, and it cannot execute financial transactions. It is a whale, powerful but beached, waiting for the tide to go out. This perceived paralysis is the mathematical incentive for a peer competitor to initiate a hegemonic challenge. The pivot to asymmetry is not a choice. It is a mathematical function of weakness. When a state's conventional power becomes a domestic liability, the regime is forced to adopt a new protocol or face systemic collapse. This is not strategy. It is a solvency crisis. CSIS analysis confirms this vector for Russia. A prolonged, unpopular war drains the treasury and liquidates public support. Every destroyed tank is not just a tactical loss. It is a debit against national solvency. The Kremlin is not fighting a war against Ukraine. It is fighting a war against its own balance sheet. This economic pressure forces a launch-on warning posture for asymmetric warfare. Reports from the Ukrainian military validate this blueprint. Russian Shahed drones, a low-cost kinetic asset, are now being armed with man-portable air defense systems. This is a desperate, yet logical, evolution. The objective is no longer to win symmetrically. The objective is to impose a disproportionate kinetic cost on the adversary. They trade a sub-$1 million improvised weapon to force a multi-million-dollar response, draining the opponent's high-end inventory. Weakness is leveraged to attack the adversary's primary strength, their capital. It's a protocol designed to make the superpower bankrupt itself. The core protocol is economic exhaustion. This is executed through a kinetic cost imposition strategy. According to the Royal United Services Institute, RUSE, the foundational math is irrefutable. A $5 million main battle tank is now systemically vulnerable to a $500 first-person view drone. This is not a balanced exchange. It is an asymmetric liability designed to liquidate a superpower's assets at a ratio of 10,000 to 1. This economic inversion is driven by a vector known as the democratization of violence. The monopoly on projecting lethal standoff force is over. Commercial technology has provided non-state and proxy actors with the tools of a modern air force for the price of a consumer electronic. We have confirmed observation of this evolution. Russian forces are now arming Shahed-class drones with portable surface-to-air missile systems, creating a low-cost hunter-killer that previously did not exist. The strategic objective is not to win a single engagement, but to trigger a systemic solvency crisis in the target superpower. Every low-cost kinetic probe forces a high-cost defensive expenditure, a multi-million-dollar interceptor missile to destroy a drone worth less than a used car. This generates a crippling drain on the Treasury, an endless operational expenditure that accumulates on the national balance sheet as a strategic liability. A peer competitor does not see battles, it sees a spreadsheet. It watches these provocations, from Ukraine to proxies in Venezuela, not as isolated crises but as data points measuring economic bleed-out. Once the ratio of debt to defense capability crosses a critical threshold, the perception of power inverts to a perception of insolvency. This provides the mathematical incentive for a hegemonic war, based on the cold calculation that the superpower can no longer afford the launch-on-warning response. The operational theater is no longer a defined battlefield. It is a distributed network of gray zones, destabilized states acting as proxy laboratories. These zones are not the cause of global conflict, they are the staging grounds. Analysis from RUSI and CSIS identifies these regions as incubators for the asymmetric escalation protocol. The objective is not to win a conventional war, but to bleed a superpower's treasury through 1,000 low-cost kinetic probes. Consider the evidence. Ukrainian military intelligence recently documented a Russian Shahed drone modified with a man-portable air defense system. This is not a random field modification. It is a blueprint. It demonstrates a core principle: weaponize low-cost platforms to force high-cost responses. The kinetic cost to intercept this asset, using, for instance, a multi-million-dollar missile, far exceeds its production cost. This is the mathematical formula for strategic bankruptcy. This asymmetry is the core of the protocol. According to Reuters, a single U.S. kinetic strike, for example in a proxy state like Venezuela, is interpreted by peer competitors as a critical data point. It confirms the superpower's launch-on-warning posture to regional provocations. Each response, no matter how justified, is entered as a liability on a strategic balance sheet. The accumulation of these high-cost defensive actions creates the perception of a systemic solvency crisis. The protocol is designed for export. Official warnings about regional instability, whether in South Africa or even Canada, are not isolated domestic issues. From a strategic vector analysis, they represent the potential expansion of the gray zone. These are the future staging areas, the next laboratories for stress testing a superpower's financial breaking point, mathematically engineering the incentive for a peer competitor to launch a final hegemonic challenge. The launch-on-warning doctrine is not a strategy. It is a mathematical protocol inherited from the Cold War. It operates on a single, brutal premise. The moment an adversary's missile launch is detected by satellite or radar, a retaliatory strike is initiated, before the incoming warhead's impact. The logic is one of asset preservation. Waiting for confirmation, the kinetic event of a city's liquidation, means your own retaliatory capability may be destroyed, guaranteeing a zero-sum defeat. It is a systemic hair-trigger designed to ensure deterrence through mutually assured destruction. This protocol, however, now contains a fatal liability. The new vector of attack is not kinetic, but digital. According to analysts at CSIS, state-sponsored cyber units are actively mapping and targeting nuclear command, control, and communications, NC3, systems. An adversary does not need to launch a missile. They only need to blind the radar. This creates the fog of digital war. For the commander, the data stream has ceased. The screens are black. The critical question becomes, is this a system malfunction, or is the lack of a signal the signal itself? Is this the moment before a decapitation strike erases the command structure? The protocol offers no room for ambiguity. In a state of total sensory deprivation, The fear of inaction forces a decision. The doctrine compels the commander to launch based on the absence of information, assuming the worst-case scenario is already in progress. This is the essence of asymmetric escalation. A low-cost cyber probe forces a potential response with an infinite kinetic cost. The adversary does not need to win a nuclear exchange. They only need to leverage this systemic flaw to create a solvency crisis, proving the superpower's own defensive protocols can be turned into a vector for self-destruction. The mathematical certainty of this dilemma is a catastrophic liability on the strategic balance sheet. The next vector of attack is not military, but actuarial. Weaker actors have mastered the protocol of asymmetric escalation. The recent Russian modification of a Shahed drone with a man-portable air defense system is not an isolated battlefield innovation. It is a cost accounting protocol. For every low-cost drone, a superpower must expend a high-cost interceptor. This is not warfare. It is a systemic drain on financial solvency, designed to bankrupt the defender mathematically. This accumulation of liabilities creates the mathematical incentive for a peer competitor to act. As analysts noted to Reuters, U.S. strategic focus on a potential intervention in a state like Venezuela creates a window of opportunity for China. Before a hegemonic challenge is launched, however, the system must be tested. A calibration shot is required, a deniable, attribution-impossible probe to measure the target's response time and political fragility. Within the next 12 months, expect a 3-day paralysis of a Tier 1 U.S. container port, likely Long Beach or New York or New Jersey. The vector will be a cyber attack against the terminal operating system, disguised as a software glitch or ransomware. The kinetic cost will be zero. The economic cost will be measured in billions per day. The true deliverable, however, is data. A peer competitor will receive the metrics needed to calculate the precise level of economic attrition required to trigger a systemic solvency crisis. The event will not be an act of war. It will be a test of an equation.